recording. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this afternoon's Ethics Forum. Does the wage show the worth? We have a really great panel today and a marvellous chairman, the Chief Executive of BCP Council, Graham Farrant. And Graham, thanks for being here, for chairing this, and I'll hand over to you now to chair this meeting.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what I hope will be a very challenging discussion. I was really interested in sharing this one. So the questions are, why the vast chasm between the best and the least and best paid workers, and how should we value different types of occupation? Really interesting for me as somebody who, since the year 2000, has had his salary published in the local paper. So at that point, I was appointed as the Chief Executive of Barking and Dagenham Council, which is the neighbouring council to where my parents lived. In fact, my dad was a policeman in Dagenham. The headline was something like, local man appointed to £100,000 plus job, at which point I always say my parents stopped my pocket money. So it was plastered on the front page of the local paper. And it's been published ever since. So I've got used to being in a world in which everybody knows exactly what I earn. It's all done through PAYE. It's all very public. And I came down to BCP Council on a well-advertised job with a well-advertised salary. And that's been referred to once or twice in the odd comment on the Echo website, if you bother to read the comments. So who decides what a job is worth? Is it the job or is it the person? Are some of the things that I would like to see us discuss. In a big business like local government, we're generally recruiting to a fixed structure. We put a value on the job and on the skills that we want. That value tends to rise as you get more managerial responsibility. And one of my challenges is that the right way of doing it, because actually we need technical expertise, we need technical experts doing a range of functions, but it's managers that get paid more than technical experts. So I'll put that challenge out there as well. Some individuals can break out of that, can't they? In the private sector, you often see individuals getting rewarded for their skills. Is that okay? Is one of my challenges as well. But if the boss gets paid more for managing, do they take responsibility? Are they held accountable for those things? And one of the things that's really interesting for me in a political world is the differential in salaries between politician and officer. So I, as Chief Executive, get paid a lot more than the leader of the council, who carries electoral and democratic responsibility for what the council does, because you can vote him or her out or in every 4 years. You get an opportunity to do that in a democratic way. The Prime Minister's salary is often used as a benchmark, but actually it's not a very good benchmark, because they quote the salary, they don't talk about the grace and favour living, they don't talk about the country residence, they don't talk about the pension, the guaranteed income through speaking engagements, etc., that makes that job far, far, far more valuable than the salary itself. So I raise all of those things and then ask questions about what's the right ratio from lowest to highest? 1 to 10, 1 to 20, 1 to 50. And if you look at some occupations, 1 to thousands, I used to measure my salary, annual salary, against the weekly salary of footballers. I have lost that race. The top footballers earn at least twice as much in a week as I can possibly earn in a year. That's an interesting scenario for somebody that runs around for 90 minutes kicking a ball. But it's obviously a much more important job than that, and it's only for 10 years. So I put all that out there and say, and the other question for me is, should we know what everybody earns? If we were all absolutely open and transparent, you'd see how we value jobs. So those are the types of things I want us to explore. We've got a great panel. So 2 community-minded business leaders, I'm told. That's going to be an interesting challenge when we talk about salaries there. So I'm going to introduce Nick Hixson first. Nick, would you like to give us your perspective on does the wage show the worth?
Yes, thank you, Graham. I'm Nick Hixson. I'm a chartered accountant. I generally work with SMEs in the UK. I've been doing that for several decades now. But I also have other responsibilities. I'm a board advisor for the World Institute of Action Learning, with strategic intent for their global deliveries. And I also am the editor of the blog series for the Global Peter Drucker Forum, which is the equivalent of the World Economic Forum for management and leadership. So I get to talk to a lot of very, very well-known management leadership gurus and some fairly well-known CEOs as well. And we've written some quite a lot on this type of topic, and with some other people, including Steve Denning, who is the former Chief Education Officer of the World Bank. We wrote a paper for the Drucker Forum about 5 years ago on shareholder value. He and I and the other people on that group are fairly appalled at the way that CEO pay is so incredibly high for the very large companies, and how that has appeared. And that's generally a function of the way in which shareholders are requiring that shareholder value increases every quarter with the quarterly earnings, and CEOs are rewarded for shareholder value rather than necessarily profits or the amount of social good that company is doing, or the way they're looking after their employees. And this again seems to be a function of the last decade's rather bureaucratic management and leadership top-down style, which has driven some of these rather excessive things. I would look in a contrast to that. I can look at some of my clients, one of which is in the Northeast. They do domiciliary care, and they've been doing domiciliary care obviously right through this pandemic, and their caregivers are paid rather better than most other ones in that sector and in that area, but nevertheless they're paid not a lot of money at all. It's not a lot more than the national living wage. They are looking after elderly people in their own homes, some of which have got serious health and mental and physical issues. They do 24-hour care on occasion. It's clearly highly vocational, and bears no relationship in terms of what they're being paid for the good they're doing to that client and the client and the family and the wider community that they're keeping that person in their home, and not being a burden on care homes or the hospitals and the like. It's just it's quite extraordinary, extreme possibilities I'm dealing with, which is quite interesting. I'm looking more these days with the rise of AI and the way in which machines are theoretically taking over what we do, is that we're moving more towards, I think, a society where we are hopefully going to start valuing personal service a great deal higher, not just people like caregivers, but hairdressers and the like, where we have the social interaction. If you want the last 12 months as your exemplar of how not to have social interactions, we're still exploring it, aren't we? So it may be that if we can change the way in which some of our larger organizations work, which I fear also that some of the government functions have taken business practices, or the worst of business practices, and incorporated them into how they should work as well, get them more into a way in which the personal service is valued better, we would develop a little bit more balance in perhaps what we're doing. It's enough for my starter, I think, Graham.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. Some really good points in there, and I think some quite interesting areas of challenge as well. Let's move on to Peter. So we've moved from an accountant to a lawyer. Is that right, Peter?
Absolutely right. And good afternoon, everybody. And very good to be able to join you this afternoon. So Peter Taylor, I'm the managing partner of a regional firm of solicitors, Paris Smith, and we've got 40 partners and 220 staff. And I was really interested in this question of wage, remuneration, and how people are valued. And it's certainly struck me during the course of the past 12 months, because how people are valued and how they're made to feel is hugely important. And certainly in the course of the pandemic will long outlast the pandemic itself. So I think wage is just one of the ingredients in how we we reward people. And there are some really good books on it. There's one by a chap called Dan Pink, which I would recommend. It's called Drive. And to what extent is money a driver for people's behavior and recognition in business? And for many, actually, it's not a key component. Yes, people want to be rewarded reasonably, but having a degree of autonomy about what they do, having some challenging work, and feeling, and I emphasize that word feeling, personally valued, is hugely important. For us in Paris Smith, we have a very clear sense of purpose. And so what binds us is that sense of purpose in enabling positive outcomes for our clients and for the communities, and a shared desire to create a thriving community for generations to come. So money, yes, it's a factor for people who are working, but it's not the be all and end all. And interestingly, over the course of the coming months, I'm sure we will come under challenge from other law firms who may be in places like London, who will be looking to tap up our staff, our very experienced lawyers, and saying, why don't you come and join us? We can offer you 50% more remuneration. But the response, if people are solely driven by money, then they may take that option. But actually, I'm confident that money for most of our people in the Paris Smith actually is not the sole driver. It is far more about that sense of purpose. And another book I would urge you to read, or indeed to listen to, is one by a chap called Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K. Simon indeed trained as a lawyer in the UK. He's an American, but then saw sense and thought that he could do rather better in the world of marketing. He wrote a very powerful book called The Power of Why, which is all around purpose of businesses. But he now talks about the infinite game. And in that, he picks up on the point that both Graham and Nick talked about in terms of the pressure of shareholders in driving those high wages and high salaries for the chief executives. And also coming into play in that is very much supply and demand, and companies stepping over each other, trying to say, well, I need to have the best person as chief executive, therefore I'm prepared to pay them more. So just thinking of it in those monetary terms, whereas, say, there is another way of thinking about it. Money is just an ingredient, but there are other ways in which you can reward and recognize people for what they do. I think another factor that we will see coming over the course of the months and coming years, again, picks up on a point that Nick made around technology and AI. One of the aspects, the good aspects that I think have come out of the past 12 months is that people are far more focused on outcomes and achievements rather than being driven by tasks. And if you can start to think, certainly, and we're doing it, in terms of employment and what service you deliver, in terms of how is that going to make a difference to people, and put a value on that, that may well start to create far more meaningful conversations around remuneration or reward for people who are working. So I hope they would give you some insights as to my thoughts, Graham.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Again, some really good challenges in there. So we'll come on to those in a second. So we've gone accountant, lawyer, now police. Executive Chief Superintendent Ben Hargreaves. So I gather, Ben, you're also doing a PhD on the ethics of policing.
I am, yes. Yeah, in my spare time.
Yeah, okay. Of course, because you must have plenty of that. Okay, Ben, your views.
Yeah. Thank you. So I will answer this question, or start it off anyway, as a police officer, But I think I can also expand on it as somebody who's had their own business and has worked in the private sector. So I've had a smattering of all of these things, and I think that for me there is a very important part of public service. And at the start of my career, somebody said something to me. They said, as a police officer, you'll never be rich, but you'll never be poor either. And I think that's very true for a lot of people who work within the public sector. And traditionally, it's probably all been seen as that source of financial stability. So in terms of things that motivate people, that give them that sense of structure in their life, having that quid pro quo, that reciprocal deal with your employer, is a fundamental part of, I think, accepting what you earn. And I will speak to colleagues up and down the country. We will be of the same rank, but we will do vastly different activities in different places. And I would never compare what I have to do with somebody who is immersed in major crime in Toxteth or some of the really deprived areas in Britain. But we earn the same money for doing what could be described as a very different job. I think that there is another element to public service, particularly when you get into the more senior roles, and that is around your ongoing liability into retirement. And people will be very familiar with the position that David Duckenfield found himself in, the retired football commander, having to give evidence in Hillsborough inquests well into his 70s. So this needs to be factored into any remuneration package. I'm going to move rooms. Sorry, everyone. I've got a barking dog and it will get right in the way. So I think Peter beat me to one point, which is around reward. And I think that when we're answering this question, we have to look at the concept of reward in its broadest terms. And there is a degree of status that comes with a job. And I think that has to be factored in. So when we're talking about what is the reward, what's remuneration, the fact that society confers upon you a certain status for doing something, for being a clergyman, that you have to take that as part of the package. Ultimately, for those looking in, this is I think an issue of fairness, and fairness is deep rooted in us from an ethical perspective. And I think that people's view on fairness and what is fair starts to expose some of their fundamental philosophical positions. Do you see the wage earning culture as a meritocracy? Should people simply be paid for the value that they add? Should people be more community focused? Should you take the fact you have got a good job to infer that, well, you've probably had a good start in life and all of the positive attributes that have allowed you to be a successful person, and should you therefore start to pay something back to society? Ultimately, I don't think any of us would want our value as a human being to be judged simply by what we hold in our bank account or what we see on our monthly salary. So I think that a separation of the financial against the contribution is something that we should also be looking at.
Okay. That's really helpful. Thanks, Dan. Some really interesting perspectives here, I think, coming out. So our next member of the panel is Rabbi Maurice Michaels. Maurice, I gather originally you were in business. I think you're back now, aren't you? But you were missing for a few seconds, but I see you're back now. So.
I apologise. I just lost my Wi-Fi.
It might be worth trying without the video, Maurice.
Doesn't matter how much you were.
Maurice,
Wi-Fi is, will disappear. Can you not hear me?
It's stuttering in and out, I think. Judging from most people are shaking their heads. Maurice. Do you want to try and dial back in a minute, Maurice? I can't actually hear you.
Graham, can you hear me?
I heard that.
Maurice has switched his camera off.
You can hear it.
Yep. Yes. Go ahead now. Go on, Maurice. Try again.
I switched my camera off. Hopefully that.
Yep.
Okay, so you can hear me now. Great.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I'm the Rabbi Bournemouth Reformed Synagogue, but previously, before becoming a rabbi, I worked in industry for a major international company. And at different times, my responsibilities included finance and also human resources, but also around businesses within the company. So I saw the differentials in salary and responsibilities at first hand from both sides, as it were, and also sometimes the difficulties that ensued. We designed, manufactured and sold communication systems and equipment. Now, putting it very, very simply, without the engineers, there was nothing to make or sell. But even the greatest design has to be manufactured so as to have a product to sell. Still needed to be marketed. So how to decide between the engineers, the craftsman's, or the salesman's worth is without considering the support people like technicians and quality control and the service people such as purchasing and finance. So we use a system which we assess what's required, responsibility for others, external relationships, and many more. And this had the effect of ensuring that a lack of a position cooler.
Oh, Maurice, I think we're losing you again. Can anybody else hear Maurice?
No.
No. Good.
Hello? Hello?
Right, Maurice, you're back. Yeah. I think we're struggling. Do you want to try dialing off and dial back in and just see if
So what I was saying was that because of the way in which it was put together, I've done that 3 times, but I'll do it again. It just keeps telling me the internet connection is unstable.
Yes, yeah.
I think I knew that. Okay, you can hear me now.
Yes, but it seems
you can hear me?
Slowing it up.
Okay, I apologise, but
Right.
I'm gonna
Oh no, I've lost you again.
pull out and try and come back. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Maurice. Thanks. I think Maurice is proving the rule in life that the whenever anybody says, "Can you hear me?" you can hear that. What you can't hear is the rest of the content. It's like when you're playing cards or a game, isn't it? Whoever says whose go it is it? It's always their go. It's one of those rules in life. Does anybody want to come in with any comments on that? I think there's been some really good points made.
Yeah.
Right. Go on, who wants to come in? Well, your name is Paul Hart.
Yeah, I'm Ruth.
Ruth.
Yeah, hello. Well, I've worked for a fairly well-known charity for a while, and recently they got rid of about 100 carers in order to replace them with 20 managers. And I thought, where is the sense that the managers are going to have fewer responsibilities? So why do we need more managers? And I thought that showed a clear example of contempt for the people that were doing the most valuable work.
That's a really interesting challenge, isn't it? Presumably they had a reason for doing that in their mind. Most people would sort of articulate that.
I'm sure they could defend their own position very well.
Do they communicate? So, Paul, did you want to come in as well?
Yes, please. You work for a council.
I do.
Do you employ your own people, or do you outsource?
Actually, this is an interesting political point. It is the Conservative controlled council. The preceding councils were Conservative controlled, but most of the services are provided by in-house teams, so we employ our own.
I worked for the London Borough of Barnet.
Yep.
I worked in the parking enforcement department there, and we were in-house to start with.
Yep.
And that was under Conservative. It was under Labour, then under Conservative, and we were doing okay. In parking, you're always bringing in money to the council.
Mm-hmm.
Before I retired, we were then outsourced. With regards to being outsourced, the company that we were outsourced to was involved in other boroughs' parking. Mm-hmm. So we found we were being put in charge of more than one council for the same money. So I don't think we were fairly treated for the increase in workload that we were expected to do.
But you were there and you did it. And part of my life, I left local government and went to run a private sector operator of leisure centres, running local government leisure centres. Some of our competitors cut the terms and conditions of the staff. We took a different view. We said we would generate revenue, so we'll generate more income, and we will cut jobs to be as efficient as we can be, but we didn't cut the terms and conditions. There's an interesting bit about how you value people, isn't it? Because yes. I suppose one question is, as employers, do we all pay the least that we have to get the skills that we need?
That's what it feels like.
Anybody else got any observations? Well, I mean, Nick, in terms of your business, do you pay more than you need to? Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Nick.
It's interesting because Peter, I beg your pardon, talked a little bit about what value you're giving to your people, and it's not just money. So I'm obviously avoiding the question by saying, of course, we're paying too much or above the going rate, but we're not. But what we're trying to do, what I try and do, is create a collegiate environment, because it's a small business, and bring them into most of the decisions that we then take. I describe them as colleagues rather than staff or employees, because I think that's pejorative these days anyway. I want their input because I cannot logically assume that I'm omniscient and have all the answers, because I haven't. So I will pay them well, I hope. We keep an eye on what our clients are doing as well. We don't tell them that they're underpaying their staff or things like that, but we do try and influence as subtly as we can as to what type of business they want to be using, how that fits with their personal objectives and what they're like as people. And frankly, if they are rapacious, they're probably not a good fit for us anyway. So we would tend to influence or attract the type of businesses who would try and treat people properly, whether it's staff or other staff, colleagues, whatever they want to call them. In fact, the whole stakeholders that they, suppliers, customers, the wider community, etc. So, Peter said quite correctly, pay is a part of that, and we pay. I think we pay the going rate plus a little bit, but I tried very much so to give them a better experience, because that's what I would want. And that's not a particularly difficult leap.
Absolutely, that's a really interesting one. And Peter, you were talking about people moving and money. My sense is that people will often move for money, but they won't necessarily stay for money. Would you agree with that, or would you challenge that?
No, I agree with that entirely. There is a saying that people don't leave businesses, they leave line managers.
Mm-hmm.
So that comes back to, it's almost as if Nick and I have met many times before, but actually we haven't met at all, but we're saying exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That collegiate and that team working is hugely important. So what I have found in my time as the managing partner is, if you make people feel inspired and feel engaged, as long as you are paying them fairly, then they will pay you back in leaps and bounds. During the course of the past few months, I know of many businesses who, through force of circumstances, dropped salaries and created redundancies. Some of them, they just couldn't avoid it. Equally, I think there were some that actually might have been able to avoid it. But I need to be able to put my head on the pillow at night and have a good night's sleep like the rest of us. And I can only do that if I've treated people fairly and consistently. So for me, where there was pain to be felt during the course of the pandemic, actually it was going to be the partners in the firm that felt the pain, not the staff, and certainly not those who are junior members of the firm or whose salary is lower than some, because they need to make ends meet. The pandemic, they didn't ask for it to come along, nor did partners ask for it to come along, but they're the ones that needed to have the support. So making sure that they felt safe and secure, and remuneration does come into that, was critical to me.
Okay. Thanks. I think, Sue, I think you indicated, but just before I bring you in, I want to jump to Ruth's question on the chat, which is about the role of gender in pay. So local government, I would say, is pretty advanced in relative terms, in terms of gender equality in particular. So one of my predecessors of the two preceding councils was a woman chief exec. My management team is pretty evenly split. I've got a woman in charge of law, man in charge of finance, woman in charge of adult social care, woman in charge of children's services, man in charge of regen, woman in charge of environment and economy. So at the most senior levels, actually really good gender balance. But it is true the council is 60% female, 40% male, and the vast majority of those women are employed in the social caring sections. And it's also true that refuse collection is very heavily male dominated. So there is still a gender inequality in different parts. What's others' experience of that now? Is that changing, and is it changing? Has it changed sufficiently? I don't know, Peter or Nick, if you'd want to come in from your perspective.
Nick, do you want to go first?
Fine. I mean, here, exactly 50-50 split. In terms of seniority, probably not quite, but that is purely a function of how old they are, rather than and how much experience they've got, rather than anything else. And I would expect my successor to be one of the girls, actually, not one of the boys. In general terms, there's still an issue nationally, internationally, and we're not going to be able to force strict 50-50 splits in terms of rewards and all the rest of it for some time, I fear. And artificial barriers are slightly self-defeating in quite a lot of areas. I think in most of the professions that there's not a major problem. I think in some of the other areas there's still significant gender bias, unfortunately. I think there is a social leaning towards eliminating that, and I think it's the views of the masses that are going to eventually erode that problem.
Okay, Ruth, before I bring Peter in, do you want to come in to add anything to your question or points?
No, just I find it really interesting that when we talk about the value of certain roles, so we talked about caring and, sorry, Paul Hart's screen, I can't remember your name, who spoke, the woman who spoke on the camera.
I'm Ruth as well.
Ruth. Oh, Ruth as well, there you go. Talking about the kind of the cutting of carers, and those roles tend to be women, and actually women have been disproportionately affected in financially in the pandemic because of the roles that they take on in society. So a wider issue, I guess, not just about remuneration within companies or certain businesses, what we value in terms of work, like what is paid work, so women doing predominantly unpaid work or being carers to elderly relatives or to those in need, and the way that maybe as society we don't value that with financial kind of reward, and the disparity that brings when we talk about earnings.
Yes. Okay, that's a really helpful point. Peter, do you want to come in?
Yeah, Ruth, you picked up interesting point there around disparities. Certainly, from the 2 points I'd like to make. One is, and reinforcing the point that Nick makes, we look to treat people, as I say, fairly, and it's irrespective of male or female, they will be rewarded exactly the same. But I think that disparity point extends internationally and culturally. And there are lots of good papers showing that where there is significant disparity in the gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid in society, there is a greater degree of prevalence of crime, of mental illness, social deprivation. Whereas in those economies which don't have that gap, actually they have generally far more harmonious and rub along together. So is that going to be the way of the future? And I think about the Scandinavian countries where there is a less of a gap than we've got in the UK or in the US.
Okay, thanks. Ben, I was going to bring you in to talk about the sort of gender equality within the police force, but also you talked about, you'd never get rich, but you won't be poor either within the police. And it feels to me, certainly you don't go into local government to get rich. Again, you've got a stable job, you've got a good pension, but the highest salaries are never going to match what the FTSE chief execs of similar sized organisations are. But the deal's not as good as it used to be. And I don't know if it is for the police or not, but certainly in local government, we've seen wages eroded through below inflation increases. We've seen pension and T's and C's eroded. It's still a pretty good deal, but it's not as good as it was. I just wondered if you wanted to reflect on that at all from the police point of view.
Yeah, I would certainly share that position. And I think that probably, along with many industries, that the deal we have now isn't as good as it used to be. My wife was very recently made redundant from her job as an airline stewardess with British Airways. And she joined in the late 80s under very different climate, when you used to get an annual gift from the chief exec and things like that. And I think a lot of these entitlements, these things that have accompanied a job, perhaps have been looked at through a different ethical lens by society over the years, and they have become, I think, less acceptable. And if you look at the financial industry, they're having to rein back on a lot of the things that drove that performance culture of annual holidays and gifts and opportunities for people to do things. So I think that there is this greater call for transparency around reward and how people are recognised. I think that the security and safety of the public sector, particularly when we start to talk about pensions, and I think that's a really a big draw for people, because it is that long-term future that certainly people of my generation, our generations, would hold very dearly. But if I have this conversation with my teenage children, they look at life in a very different way, and the prospect of a career for life fills them with fear and dread, even though there's the promise of a pension. But of course, pensions are getting less less secure, and I think it's very likely in a few years that we'll see the public sector driven with short-term contracts and a much less pension-driven approach. That there is one area that I will say is an exception, and that is an interesting one, and that's the world of cyber. We are finding that this is now such an emerging and specialist part of policing that we can't recruit into the jobs that we need to recruit into, because we're so restricted in terms of the way we pay people, because of a disciplined hierarchical rank structure and set of pay grades. We actually can't recruit the people into the public sector because they're being paid so much, because they're in short demand in the private sector. So this is one area that's perhaps already challenging some of these traditional stoic public sector job mentalities.
That's a really good point, and it is back to, should we have more flexibility? Are we paying what the market values the job at, or are we paying what society values the job at? And I think there's a really clear distinction in there. And sometimes you just have to pay what the market values it at, otherwise you won't get anybody. And that's the downside, isn't it? Maurice, I see you've rejoined us. Do you want to come in and finish what you were saying by way of introduction?
I'd love to, but I mean, I do apologise if what I'm saying has already been covered by, in the conversation by the speakers. Obviously, I don't want anybody to hear them. But I mean, the point that Bevan was just making, and which you made very, very early on, Graham, about sort of levels at which you can't recruit people, or because your manager has to earn more than the people working for them. In other words, the hierarchy was something which we actually 30 years ago in industry recognised and did away with. I mean, literally, then we were I was in a lab which was employing 2,500 people. I was responsible for HR, amongst other things, and we recognised that if we were going to get the absolute tip-top engineers, the best scientists that we possibly could, then we had to have two scales. Yep. You had one professional scale and you had one managerial scale. And we had people who were, I had people working for me who were earning more than me because they were professional in a particular field and we really needed them. And it was irrelevant, the fact that, that I was their boss. And that's the way we worked in that. And that was 30 years ago. And it seems crazy that the public sector has still not caught up with that, with an understanding of that need and that requirement.
I think my sense is that we're more commonly now breaking the pay scales to get in specialist knowledge when we need to. But it's certainly not the norm.
But what we effectively did was to say, okay, we need two pay scales.
Yeah. I get that.
And I said, and we did that. So if I can just sort of follow on from there, that one of the things that because we created scales based on a whole range of different dimensions, we were able to recognise these skills in a particular field, which weren't necessarily managerial. Because, one of the things that I found when I moved into this particular position was that we had some incredibly good professional scientists who were managing departments and making an absolute hash of it because that wasn't their skill. But that was the only way we could promote them, as it were. And that's why we put in place this idea of keeping the real professionals separate from the managerial. Now, so as a result of which, what we were doing was creating a salary scale which was commensurate with the person's worth to the organisation. It also ensured that there were no differentials between men and women doing the same or an equivalently valued job. If you've got a proper sort of scheme in place, you make sure that that just doesn't happen. And again, talking 30 years ago, we had women earning absolutely the same as the men in the same jobs or equivalent jobs. Now, okay, we were able to do this because we were operating within a single company, albeit with a variety of branches and functions. But what was absolutely essential in the whole of the thing was complete objectivity. And we did that by taking the responsibility for grading a person's job out of the department and putting it into the HR function. And the HR function didn't know whose job they were grading. It was done absolutely objectively. The problem, of course, is, as I say, we had that advantage. It was a single company. But who's going to produce a system that can evaluate what salary differential there should be between a footballer and a nurse, an entertainer and a shelf stacker, a politician and a pizza deliverer, and if I dare say it, a banker and a vicar. Because worth, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. And while probably every reasonable person would cringe at some of the current salary differentials we have, creating something that was really equitable would really be, you know, it's so difficult, it could be impossible. I recall from my youth that there were several occupations, like teaching, nursing, the clergy among them, that were regarded as vocations. And so there was considered to be a job satisfaction level that in some ways counterbalanced the fact that the salary wasn't as great. And also there was a particular standing in the community that such vocations warranted. We've lost that stature now for any particular job or any particular role. If it hadn't been for the pandemic, you wouldn't have had anybody clapping nurses, even though, you know, nurses should be clapped every day of the week and every year, you know, because that's, you know, the sort of work and job that they do. But actually, that's not what it's all about. Huge salaries are paid to those who generate huge amounts of money to their employers. And that's really what the basis of payment, of worth and payment. If your employer believes that you're bringing in, that you're making a contribution, that you're providing them with profit levels, then they'll pay you. You know, it's what Ben was saying just now about with this, you know, people in the cyber industry. If you believe that you have to have them because they're giving you what you need, then you pay them. Yeah. That's the way it works. Often, not always, but often, people in that situation have actually a short career. It's great while it lasts.
Okay. That's really helpful, and I guess it gives us a challenge of how you value that sort of skills and worth in the public sector, in the charitable sector, in some other areas. And let me just, Sue, did you indicate earlier on, do you want to come in? Because then I've got a Gareth wants to come in as well. So you're on mute.
I think it's actually passed by what I was going to originally say, but Peter did just raise a fact about people leaving through line managers at times. And through, I mean, I've retired a few years now, but through working life, especially the latter, but not so much the early part of my working life, but the latter part of my working life, I found more people within work leaving because of the attitude of line managers.
Yes.
Whereas earlier, all through my career, people were promoted through the company, knew the job and knew what it entailed and knew the essence of the company. People were brought in from outside and without even trying to find out how things had been run or how it worked, came in with their own ideas and wanted to change everything overnight and really undervalued the staff that they took over and quite often were quite rude and the way they looked at them. And I particularly found it within Southampton City Council, to be quite honest. That's about the only points I'll make now.
Okay. Thanks, Sue, and apologies for my chairing that allowed the moment to pass you by.
That's all right, no problem.
Gareth, do you want to come in as the last contribution before I go back to our panellists?
Yeah, sure. So I've had a very mixed career. I began life as a medic, and I worked my way through the medical profession, and I've still never been paid more than I was paid when I was 29 as a doctor. When I left medicine, I found that I wanted to go into prevention work rather than on site dealing with the issues. And so I ended up doing some education work, and I did all of it for free. And the contribution to society must have been an awful lot more than I was simply doing in actual practice, because I was trying to prevent young people getting into drug and alcohol abuse. Then I went into the ministry, and I was paid an awful lot less than I was in medicine. And I ended up starting a number of charities, one of them being a very large refugee charity that shipped aid to probably 250,000 people in the space of about 4 months from Scotland. That was all for free. And I was just getting paid by the church to run effectively Sunday morning services. Now I'm a chief executive of a large charity, and I feel terribly guilty about being paid 3 times more than the lowest paid person in the organization. And I understand that's pretty low, CEO, but I can actually afford to start contributing to a pension now, which means I'm probably not going to retire poor. But here I am feeling guilty because I'm a CEO earning more money than the person on the front line. Yeah. So the question is, for me, how do you value my work? Because I'm also a doctor, I'm a professional in ethics, I'm a CEO, I'm a church minister, and I've done a wide variety of work, some of it for free that has huge impact, and some of it that isn't for free, that doesn't feel like it's had an awful lot of impact.
That's a really interesting challenge, Gareth. And I think from my point of view as the chief exec, I'll refer that to HR. I think that's probably the easiest way. Because actually what you're bringing to that role is all of your life experience and all those other experiences as well. That's a really interesting challenge. But we only have 6 minutes left. So I'm going to go in reverse order through Ben, Peter, and then Nick to get final contributions. And we may have to leave that hanging out there. Ben, do you want to go first? We've got about a minute each.
Thank you. So I think Gareth really summed it up nicely. And when I talk about reward, I talk about reward and recognition. And I think it is absolutely that recognition that's so important. And it's incumbent upon society to recognise the value that people bring, not simply the pound notes that they bring to the table. So I won't take anybody else's space. That's my ending. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, but really helpful. Peter.
I would echo that. And the only other thing that I would add is the importance of having open and honest and transparent conversations. I was very touched by some of the comments that Sue was making about people coming in and purporting to be line managers. Actually, you've got to take people on a journey with you, and communication is two-way. It's not just delivery of information. You've got to make sure that you're taking your people with you. They feel valued. They feel part of the organisation. Financial reward is part of that, but there is, as we've discussed over the past hour, there is just so much more to it in terms of how you recognise people and how you make them feel.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Nick.
Okay, trying to sum up a little bit then, to try and get past some of the gender bit, how about we take some of the ego, which is a largely male characteristic, out of most of these conversations wherever possible. The value is the other thing. We talk about the vocational aspect of some of the things we've been discussing, and these things are value. The only value we're using now, as Ben said, is the numbers. It's the money. It's the show me the money nonsense. And I really think and believe and hope that that is all last century, and we are now moving into a slightly more human and socially engaged society. It'll be interesting when we get back to being able to see one another face to face, whether that lasts much longer, but I do pray for it.
It's been really helpful. Thanks, Nick. And Maurice, do you want to add anything as a final comment?
I mean, I love what everybody's now said at the end, in summation. I think what we also have to recognise is that this is actually a problem that will never be solved, because there are always going to be periods of time when certain things are more recognised as more important than others, and it's going to change over time. I talked about the clapping of the nurses. We have a feeling about the NHS at the moment, and the people who work for the NHS, which was very different to what we were thinking about in 2019. And it'll probably be very different in 2022. So these are the things which are changing. The main thing, as I say, is it's not society which determines the worth. It's the employer.
All right, that's really helpful. Thanks very much, everybody. Some really good insights and some really good challenges in there. I'm going to leave you with one final thought. 2 years ago, when I was Chief Executive of Farrant Council, I was on a ward meeting down in Tilbury, which is not the most salubrious of areas, as you'll know. If you know the area, it's quite interesting. High levels of unemployment, poor housing, etc. The leader was chairing the meeting, the leader of the council, about 120, 130 people there. One of them asked, how on earth do you, I think he had a few expletives in there, but basically, how on earth do you justify the chief exec's exorbitant salary? At which point the Labour leader of the council stood up, started to speak, and then said, I don't know why I'm justifying your salary, Graham. You have a go at defending yourself. At which point I had to stand up in front of the crowd and do that. All I can say is I didn't talk for so long that anybody fell asleep. Nobody threw anything, and therefore that's the mark of a really good presentation in my view. And at the end of the meeting, we got a collective round of applause, so it can't have gone too badly. But when your salary's out there in the public eye, it's a really interesting challenge for people that are paying you. Those of you that are council taxpayers in the BCP area, you pay my salary. I'm beholden to you for that. Thank you for that. Please keep paying your council tax. That's been a really interesting, really good, challenging meeting. Thank you very much. Some good comments on the sidebar as well. Julia, really good comment there. Actually, yeah, don't clap, just pay us a better salary for nurses and care workers. That's a really good challenge to us all, I think, and to value those professions. But thank you very much for attending. I hope it's been useful. Ian, I hope it's gone somewhere near meeting your aspirations for the meeting, and I look forward to seeing you at a future meeting. Thanks very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Graham. And thank you also, Peter, Nick, Maurice and Ben. And next week at 3 o'clock on the same YouTube channel, we are on the same Zoom channel, we think from a different angle about the money that we've been mentioning so much today. Money and worth. Shop until you drop, retail therapy or mindless hoarding. Are there limits to the amount we should spend on shopping? Come on board again next week, ladies and gentlemen, and repeating our thanks to Graham as chair and to our marvellous panelists. Thank you all for participating. See you next week at